So in our American Revolution Part 1 video, we looked at the strategies of the British and the Americans. We looked at the strengths and weaknesses of the British and the Americans, and we also looked at the First Continental Congress, and we looked at the shot heard around the world, and that was the battle at Lexington and at Concord. And the things that we want to look at today in today's video is we're going to analyze two of the early battles in the American Revolution. We're also going to look at the Second Continental Congress and what was the result of the Second Continental Congress, and we're going to look at a little pamphlet called Common Sense that was written by a guy named Thomas Paine that served as something to really help inspire the Americans. So let's start with reviewing the strategies for both sides. The British were looking to just show up. They also wanted to capture American cities, and they wanted to wait out the American army. The American strategy, on the other hand, was much different. Because they had so many disadvantages, their strategy was to avoid head-on battles. They wanted to rely on outfoxing the British, using better battle strategy, better military strategy. And finally, they wanted to get help from other countries. So let's look at a couple of early battles. We'll start with the Battle of Bunker Hill. And at Bunker Hill, what happens is the British are out in Boston Harbor, and the Americans know that at any point the British are going to come on shore and attack. And so the Patriots, or the Americans, they dig in on a hill called Breed's Hill that was just north of Boston. It was a fairly steep hill. And this is where the famous phrase, "Don't fire until you see the whites in their eyes," comes from. The commander of the American soldiers only had a certain amount of ammunition. The American soldiers on the hill were limited in how much ammo they had, but they were dug in on top of a hill. And in battle, it's always your advantage if you have the high ground. If you have the high ground, your opponent has to march uphill towards you fully exposed, whereas you can dig in, you can dig trenches so that most of your body is concealed and is not reachable by your enemy. So you can be firing downhill at your enemy as they march up the hill, and that's what the position the Americans found themselves in here. And frankly, if the Americans would have had more ammunition, they probably could have held this hill forever. But unfortunately, they didn't have a lot of ammunition, and so the commander of the Americans said, "Don't fire until you see the whites in the eyes of your enemy." And the reason for this is the closer they were, the more accurate they could be with their shots. And so the commander didn't want to waste ammunition. And so the British march up the hill the first time, and the Americans, with their superior high ground, they fire down on the British, and the British retreat back. And the British form up their lines again, like you see in the picture here, and they march up the hill again the second time. And again, the Americans are able to fire upon the British, and the British are forced to fall back. Well, the third time, when the British form up their lines and they begin to march up the hill, the Patriots run out of ammunition. And when they run out of ammunition, they are forced to retreat, and the British take the hill, and the British win the Battle of Bunker Hill. But there's a very important takeaway from the Battle of Bunker Hill. Even though it wasn't a victory for the Patriots, it wasn't a victory for the Americans, the most important thing to take away from the Battle of Bunker Hill is that it proved to the British that the Patriots could fight. And this was a big deal because remember from the video earlier in the week that the British came here basically thinking that the Patriots and the Americans were a bunch of backwards hillbillies, a bunch of rednecks. And when the Battle of Bunker Hill happens and the British are just mowed down for two assaults on this hill, Breed's Hill, they're mowed down twice in a row by the Americans, the British realize that this is going to be a real war. This isn't going to be just them marching on a bunch of backwards farmers and taking whatever they need. This was going to be a real battle. And so the Battle of Bunker Hill proves that the Patriots could fight with the British. Well, that was in 1775, and later on in the year, at a place called Dorchester Heights, another very important battle takes place. And frankly, we could maybe not even call this one a battle because there really weren't many, if any, shots fired. But this was the first time during the American Revolution where George Washington is able to outfox the British. Okay, the Battle of Bunker Hill and the battles of Lexington and Concord that we talked about before, George Washington is not on the scene yet. The Second Continental Congress has not appointed him to be in charge of the Continental Army yet, and so George Washington is not around. But at the Battle of Dorchester Heights, he is around. He has just arrived from early 1776, and he has just arrived from from Philadelphia, where the Continental Congress, the Second Continental Congress, has assigned him to be the leader of the Continental Army. So all of the American Army is now run by George Washington. And when he gets to Boston and he takes a look and he sees that the British have the whole Boston harbor surrounded and the city of Boston is at risk of being taken by the British, and he starts to think about some ideas about how he could change this. And the first thing that happens is the Americans achieve a small victory at Fort Ticonderoga in western New York. And this is about 300 or so miles from Boston. But when they achieve this victory, there are a whole bunch of really big battery or artillery pieces, cannons basically, big cannons that George Washington looks at and says, man, I wish I could have those at Boston. We could really use them. Well, it's the middle of the winter between 1775 and 1776, and Henry Knox, a former bookstore owner who has now joined the American cause and is fighting with George Washington, says, you know what, give me the opportunity. I can get those cannons from Fort Ticonderoga all the way to Boston. And so in the middle of winter, in an unbelievable feat, using oxen and horses, Henry Knox and some men are able to pull many of these huge cannons 300 miles across New York into Boston in the middle of winter, which gives George Washington an idea as to what he's going to do. And here's what he decides. In the middle of the night, when the British are all basically asleep, Washington moved all of his artillery, all these cannons that Henry Knox had brought from Fort Ticonderoga, and his troops up onto these hills to the south of Boston called Dorchester Heights. And they moved up quietly in the middle of the night and dug in their cannons and dug in their men on these heights that overlook Boston Harbor. And in the picture that you see here, you can get a general idea. This is a painting. You can get some idea of what this might have looked like. Where the people are on the rocks here at the front of the picture is kind of where George Washington's men would have been. And when the sun came up the next morning, the British wake up on their ships and they see all of George Washington's men and his cannons up on the heights of Dorchester Heights. And remember when we talked about Bunker Hill just in the last slide, I talked about how the high ground is always the most important in battle. And now George Washington's men with their cannons are up on top of these cliffs with their guns and cannons pointed right at the British ships in the harbor. And the British admiral that's in charge has to make a decision. At this point, Admiral Howe was his name. He has to decide, what is he going to do? Is he going to unload his men and try to march up these cliffs and attack George Washington's men who have the clear advantage? Or is he going to pack up his men and sail out of the harbor and retreat to fight another day? And this brilliant outfoxing move by George Washington, this brilliant tactical move of moving his men up in the middle of the night onto the cliffs, turns out to be a victory for the Americans, because the British pack up and they sail their ships back out into the ocean, out of Boston Harbor. If they wouldn't have, George Washington's men with their cannons could have opened fire on them and literally sunk their ships in the harbor. So Dorchester Heights is a great victory for the Americans without really even firing any shots. They achieve a great victory because George Washington uses his brains to outfox the British, the British were taking for granted that the Americans wouldn't have a chance to climb up these cliffs. So that's Dorchester Heights. So far today we've talked about Bunker Hill, which was a victory for the British but proved that the Americans could fight. And we've talked about Dorchester Heights, which is where George Washington outfoxes the British by climbing up the heights in the middle of the night and wins a great victory. So these things are happening in 1775 and the beginning of 1776. And many people are being inspired to fight with the Americans, but one little booklet has more of an impact, really, than almost anything else. A man named Thomas Paine, who came here from Great Britain and was a struggling writer, really didn't have a lot, wasn't doing that great in terms of his success in life and as a business person, but he was a writer. When he saw George Washington's army, he was inspired by them, and he wrote a pamphlet called Common Sense. And in this pamphlet that he wrote in 1776 called Common Sense, he made an argument that citizens of a country should be the ones who make the decisions for the government, not kings. He basically said, look, we've had a king for so long, and that king is always making decisions for us. Why shouldn't we, the people, be the ones making the decisions? And this pamphlet was unbelievably good. It did a great job of getting the colonists fired up against the British. He published a pamphlet in Philadelphia, and within 10 years, he sold 500,000 copies, 500,000 copies in 10 years. And Thomas Paine's Common Sense pamphlet ends up being one of the things that contributes to people joining the cause of the American Revolution. So, what I want you to do is I want you to keep in mind this idea of common sense and Thomas Paine's pamphlet, because your second diary entry, which you're going to do on the next assignment after you take the quiz for this video, your second diary entry is going to be about common sense. So Thomas Paine's Common Sense, and what kind of impact would that have on you if you were a patriot soldier and you read this pamphlet that's basically arguing the reasons why you're fighting for your freedom? Or if you're the wife of a patriot soldier and your husband has already gone off to war, what kind of impact would reading this pamphlet have on you? Or if you're a patriot spy, George Washington is now in charge, maybe you've started communicating spy messages to him of what the British are saying, and you read this pamphlet that's saying that you should have these rights of freedom, what kind of impact does that have on you? And finally, if you're the British soldier, you find out about this pamphlet and you read it or you hear it read, does this make you mad? Does this make you think that you're going to be stuck in America for a longer period of time for the war? What kind of impact would it have on you? So, the Second Continental Congress is the next thing we're going to talk about, and this took place over a 2-year period from 1775 to 1776, where delegates from all 13 colonies were going to Philadelphia at different times to meet and discuss some things. Now remember, the First Continental Congress in 1774 basically said 4 things. They said they wanted to remain British, they protested the acts by the king, they told each of the colonies to form their local militias, and they agreed to meet again the next year. So here we are, it's the next year, 1775, and they're meeting again, and they have now decided that they are going to do some other things. In fact, they start to act like an actual government. And this is a big deal, because the Continental Congress now starts to act like they're their own government. They also created an army. Okay, that's the Continental Army we already talked about, and they appoint George Washington to be general of the Continental Army. The third thing they do is they begin to negotiate treaties and borrow money from other countries like France and Spain and the Netherlands. And when they do this, when they start to negotiate with other countries, that is really an act of acting like you are a government. Finally, they begin to also print their own money. So all of these steps are really kind of taking the Continental Congress and saying, we're now America. We're starting to act like a country. So we're negotiating treaties. We're borrowing money from other countries. We are printing our own money. We're forming an army. And all of these things the Second Continental Congress does. They also do one other thing. In June of 1776, they appoint a panel of delegates to write a document declaring their independence from Great Britain. And we know this as the Declaration of Independence, of course. And the Declaration of Independence was officially ratified on either July the 3rd or July the 4th of 1776. Of course, we know the date July the 4th, 1776, because that's the day we still celebrate today as Independence Day. So, but July the 4th was more than just planning a day where we could eat hot dogs and watch fireworks, but it was also, it's kind of a signature or a symbol of our American freedom. Now, did all 55 guys sign the Declaration of Independence on July 4th? No, they did not. In fact, it was about a 6 or 7 week period between July and August of 1776 where the delegates were coming into Philadelphia from their different places where they lived, and they were signing it. However, most of the Declaration of Independence was written by one man, Thomas Jefferson. And he had some help from other people like John Adams and Ben Franklin, but he wrote most of the Declaration. And in the Declaration of Independence, probably the most famous part of it is the unalienable rights that Jefferson writes about, which are our rights as Americans, as citizens, to life, where we have the right to be alive, to liberty, which is another word for freedom, and we have the right to pursue our own happiness. And when we see the word unalienable, these are rights that are given to us by God, rights that we're born with, is what Thomas Jefferson was saying. And the Declaration of Independence becomes a huge, huge deal. This is the United States of America being unofficially formed. When the Declaration of Independence is written and we say, Great Britain, you know what, England, we're no longer going to be part of your country. We are now our own country. This is the unofficial formation of the United States of America. The official formation of the United States of America would come in 1783, 7 years later, when the British signed the peace treaty that gives the United States their freedom. However, the Declaration of Independence is very important, probably the most important document in our history as a country, as a nation, because it was the people of the United States saying to Great Britain, we want to have our own freedoms as people. We want to be able to run our own government. So it was a really, really big deal. So, with that in mind, your next diary entry, which I'll have an assignment on here for you, will be based on the Declaration of Independence. And that, again, you'll be writing from the perspective of your character. What would your emotions be like? What would you be thinking when you read or hear about the Declaration of Independence? We are now saying, as Americans, we are going to be our own country. We're not going to be part of Great Britain anymore. So go ahead and take the quiz that goes with this video. When you're finished with the quiz, you can go back, go to the next 2 diary entries. You'll have a diary entry about the Thomas Paine's Common Sense pamphlet, and you will also have a diary entry about the Declaration of Independence.